You've probably seen them, neat little packages stacked on store shelves, soft pastel colors, smiling babies on the front. Pampers, a household name. Trusted, harmless, right? But what if I told you there's a story buried under all that? Marketing gloss, a story filled with allegations, chemical warnings, and quiet lawsuits, a story that most parents have never heard. Tonight, we're peeling back that plastic wrap, and once you hear what's inside, you might never look at a diaper the same way again. It began quietly, almost innocently, the way many of history's most dangerous stories do. No sudden flash of light. No loud alarms. Just the soft, almost soothing whisper of a promise. Life could be easier now. No more scrubbing in the sink until your hands ached. No more boiling fabric in heavy pots while steam stung your eyes. No more endless cycles of wash and dry that seemed to consume a young mother's every waking hour. The world was changing, and this was supposed to be progress. At first, it seemed harmless, enough ingenious even. A new kind of diaper, disposable, light, neat, a marvel of modern manufacturing that could be used once and tossed away like yesterday's newspaper. No mess, no stains, no waiting for the sun to dry cloth. It was wrapped in soft, bright packaging, each one marked with smiling faces and words like dry, gentle, protect. A parent could look at it and feel a little lighter inside, convinced that this was the future of care. The timing was perfect. Society was rushing toward convenience like a moth to a glowing lamp. Supermarkets were filling with packaged meals, plastic containers, ready-made, everything. And here was another miracle of efficiencia, solution to one of the messiest, most relentless parts of raising a child. It slid neatly into the new rhythm of life, and no one wanted to question it. And why would they? The advertisements were carefully crafted, slow, warm camera pans over healthy babies resting peacefully, the faint sound of lullabies playing in the background. Mothers shown with hair neatly pinned, makeup perfect, cradling infants in arms, free from the damp, heavy fabric of cloth diapers. The message was subtle but effective. You're a better parent when you choose this. It wasn't just about Denise, it was about identity, status, and love. Soon, they were everywhere. A small invention had become a towering empire. Stacks of them appeared in grocery stores, drug stores, even corner shops. Delivery trucks rumbled through neighborhoods carrying pallets wrapped in shining plastic, their wheels grinding the pavement as if feeding a growing hunger. And the hunger was real. People didn't just buy them, they bought into the idea of them. That perfect blend of trust and necessity, but hidden in that rise beneath the clean lines of the packaging and the softness of the product was something no one bothered to ask. What exactly are we putting against the skin of the most delicate creatures in our care? It's strange, looking back, how silence can grow louder than a scream when it's shared by millions. No one asked. No one wanted to. And those who might have scientist doctors were, wrapped in a fog of marketing charm and corporate assurances, safe became the word of the day. and no one dared to probe the depth of what safe truly meant. Factories buzzed with production lines that moved like clockwork. Thousands upon thousands of diapers rolling off belts each hour, destined for homes around the world. The smell of processed pulp and chemical binders lingered in the air, though the final product would carry only the faintest trace of scent, so neutral it barely existed. Perfect for something meant to be invisible in daily life. As the years passed, the empire's roots grew deep. Competitors emerged, but the first to plant its flag held the ground. It became a trusted name, a fixture of modern parenting. There was something unsettling in that trust, the way it was so freely given, like handing over a key without asking where it might fit. Parents assumed that if it was on the shelf, it had been tested, proven beyond doubt. But history has a way of whispering warnings before it screams them. Even in those early days, long before the whispers would grow into accusations, there were moments tiny, almost invisible, that hinted at what was to come. A baby with an unexplained rash that lingered for days. A faint, unusual odor from a fresh package. The way the materials sometimes left faint marks on soft skin. These were dismissed as coincidences, as one. After all, millions of children wore them without complaint. At least, that's what everyone was told. The rise was meteoric, but meteors burn bright before they fall. And though no one could see it yet, something dangerous had already been set in motion. Not an accident. Not a fluke. Something built into the very structure of this perfect convenience. The secret was not in what they added to the diapers, but in what they didn't tell you about what was already there. The public saw a revolution in childcare. They didn't see the quiet shift how reliance turned into dependence. How parents no longer knew how to go back to cloth. How the market began to dictate choices rather than the other way around. It was no longer just a product. It had become an unshakable part of the way people lived, and that perhaps is the most dangerous thing of all. Because when something becomes that deeply woven into daily life, it stops being a choice. And when it stops being a choice, you stop questioning it. The walls go up around the truth, the lights dim, and the story waits silent for the day the cracks begin to show. That day would come. But in these early years, the shadow was just beginning to form, stretching long and thin behind a smiling baby on a package, growing darker with every diaper sold. Asterisks. It started as a trickle small enough to ignore, soft enough to dismiss. A message on a parenting forum, a late-night post buried deep in a social media group, a photo shared privately between friends. There was no shouting, no headlines, just a quiet exchange of unease. A mother wondering why her baby's skin had turned angry red in a matter of hours. Another saying the same thing had happened to her zits, swelling, tiny blisters that looked far too severe to be ordinary diaper rash. The images were hard to look at. Soft, delicate skin, mottled with raw patches, the kind that made you wince. Just imagining the pain. But what made them worse was how fast it happened. Some parents claimed it appeared overnight. Others said they saw changes within a single afternoon. There was an urgency in their voices, a desperation in the way they described it. Each one seemed hesitant, almost afraid to say the words out loud. It might be the diapers. At first, the whispers stayed in their small, shadowed corners of the internet. People were cautious. No one wanted to believe that something so trusted, so deeply tied to caring for a child, could be the cause. But the posts kept coming. They came from different cities, different countries. The details varied, but the core was always the same to the new product. And something strange would happen. The skin would break out. A fever would follow. The baby would scream in a way that didn't sound like normal crying. There's a certain rhythm to these kinds of whispers. They start uncertain, wavering, just one story among the noise. Then, one by one, they begin to line up, stacking like bricks into something harder to ignore. By the time there were dozens of similar accounts, the pattern was too sharp to overlook. But the problem with patterns is that they demand those in control rarely offer one willingly. Some parents reached out to the company. They sent emails, made calls, attached photos, detailed the symptoms with care. They expected concern, maybe even alarm. Instead, they were met with the same flat reassurance. The product is safe. Irritation happens. Every baby's skin is different. It's not the diaper. There's something chilling about a denial given with such calm certainty, as if the possibility of harm had never even crossed their minds. But behind that calm, you could almost hear the unspoken message. Stop asking questions. For some, that was enough. They stopped. They switched brands quietly, tossed away the rest of the package, and moved on without looking back. But others kept digging. They began comparing notes, dates, lot numbers, materials. Some even cut the diapers apart, examining the strange, absorbent crystals inside, sniffing the faint chemical smell that had never been mentioned in the cheerful ads. It wasn't just irritation they feared, it was the unknown. Because what is more terrifying for a parent than putting something directly against their child's skin, something they use every single day without knowing what it's truly made of? As the months went on, the whispers grew louder. Carried by the velocity of the digital age, a post would vanish deleted by a moderator, claimed to be unverified, but not before it was screenshotted and reposted somewhere else. Photos were shared in closed groups, accompanied by warnings to friends and family. There was an eerie feeling to it all, the way a storm feels just before it breaks. The sense that something larger was building, something that couldn't be brushed aside forever. But still, the company stood firm. Their words were polished. The same rehearsed lines repeated to anyone who asked. The diapers had been tested. They met safety standards. There was nothing to worry about. And yet, worry has a way of taking root when it's fed with silence. The more official statements downplayed the complaints, the more people began to wonder what was being left unsaid. Why no public investigation? Why no recall? Why no effort to find the link between the product and the sudden, severe reactions? The unease began to spill into the offline world. A mother at a grocery store, glancing nervously at the shelves, telling another to be careful. A father in a pediatric waiting room, overhearing someone describe the same rash, the same timing. These were strangers, yet their stories matched almost perfectly. It was becoming harder to believe in coincidence. Still, there was resistance. Friends dismissed it as paranoia. Doctors pressed for time, relying on official guidance, repeated the same corporate reassurance, and the company continued to deny any connection, calling the online posts misinformation or isolated cases. But misinformation doesn't leave marks on a baby's skin. What began as a few quiet warnings had grown into a fractured but determined network of voices. They didn't have the power of advertising budgets or corporate lawyers. What they had were stories, and once you've seen enough of them, they start to paint a picture no press release can erase. The strange thing about these moments in history is how they feel just before they break wide open. There's a heavy stillness, like the air is holding its breath. Everyone knows something is wrong, but no one can say how deep it goes. And in that space, in that pause, before the truth is forced into the light, fear becomes its own language. For the parents watching their children's skin blister and burn, fear had already translated into action. They warned each other in private messages. They saved receipts, photographed lot numbers, archived every reply they received from customer service. They didn't know if anyone would believe them, but they knew deep down that this wasn't just bad luck. The truth was out there. But it was still tangled in whispers that the world had not yet decided to hear. And until it did, the shelves would remain stocked, the packages would remain bright and smiling, and the warnings would remain in the shadows, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen. It is easy to trust what you can see. The soft outer layer, the neat stitching, the comforting weight of something designed for care. But the danger here was never in what met the eye. The danger lived beneath it, woven into the fibers, hiding in layers most people would never think to look at, let alone touch. For years, no one asked what these diapers were actually made of. It seemed unnecessary, almost absurd. They were clean, white, and gentle to the touch. They smelled faintly of nothing, just the quiet, neutral air of something that had been packaged in a sterile room. But the truth is that absence of smell can be as deceptive as perfume. A lack of odor doesn't mean a lack of presence. It only means what's there doesn't want to be noticed. The first hints came from those who refused to stop asking questions. People who took scissors to the product and cut it open, laying its insides bare on kitchen tables. What they found was strange gel crystals that shimmered under the light as if they were something precious. These tiny beads had the power to absorb incredible amounts of liquid, swelling too many times their size. That power was their selling point. But power always comes at a cost. The material inside, known for its miraculous absorption, had a history in other products, some harmless, some not. There were whispers in old medical literature, accounts from a different industry altogether, where a similar substance had been linked to a frightening condition. But here, it was locked away inside layers of fabric, hidden from view. Or so it seemed. Anyone who had torn open a saturated diaper knew the crystals sometimes escaped, clinging to skin. And if they could escape, they could also linger. There were other findings, too. Compounds with names that sounded almost harmless, the kind that slip past the mind because they don't scream danger in everyday conversation. But when traced back to their origins, the picture changed. Some were byproducts of bleaching processes, leaving behind residues the human body was never meant to welcome. Among them was a compound quietly recognized by global health organizations as toxic even in small doses. Substance that doesn't just vanish when you throw the diaper away. It lingers in the environment, in the air, and perhaps in the body. Tests performed outside official channels detected traces of volatile organic compounds, the kind that evaporate invisibly into the air you breathe, carrying with them risks that stretch beyond a single moment's exposure. Headaches, dizziness, developmental harm when inhaled or absorbed over time, the kind of harm that doesn't make itself known right away. It creeps in slowly, wearing away at the body like water dripping against stone. There was something deeply unsettling about the way these results were received. Official responses dismissed them as inconsequential, citing low levels well within safety limits. But those limits are often written for the average adult, not for the most vulnerable among us. And these weren't occasional exposures, so they were daily, constant, wrapped snugly against the thinnest, most delicate skin on the human body. Skin that doesn't yet know how to defend itself in private conversations. Some experts admitted the truth. Safe is a slippery word. Safe compared to what? Safe for how long? Safe for whom? The science behind chemical exposure in infants is far from complete, and the gaps in that knowledge can swallow entire truths. But the public was not given the luxury of hearing these doubts. Instead, they were handed the same phrase again and again. There is nothing to worry about. The worry, however, was not so easily because once you know that certain toxins have no safe threshold, that even the smallest trace can be enough to trigger changes. Deep within a body, still learning how to grow, you cannot unknow it. You cannot shake the thought of it sitting there, pressed close for hours at a time, day after day. And it wasn't just about direct harm. Some of these substances were linked to environmental damage on a scale so vast it almost seemed abstract. But the connection was there. Chemicals that persist for decades in soil and water, that move through food chains, that find their way back to the very people who thought they had thrown them away. When you look closely, the story of these diapers becomes less about convenience and more about control. The control to decide what is hidden and what is revealed. The chemical list was never printed on the package. Parents were never given a full breakdown of what made up the product they trusted most. And perhaps that was the most chilling part. The absence of transparency was not an accident. It was a choice. For those who had seen the lab reports, who had touched the materials with bare hands, who had read the warnings buried deep in obscure safety sheets, there was a kind of cold fury. They understood that the danger was not in a single ingredient, but in the cocktail untested combination of substances interacting in ways no one had truly studied in infants. Alone, each might be deemed acceptable. Together, no one really knew, and that is the kind of ignorance that corporations can survive. But children cannot die in the quiet of night. After changing a diaper, some parents began to wonder not just about what they were putting on their child, but about how many other everyday products carried similar secrets. They realized that the softness they felt under their fingers was not the whole truth, that Beneath the comforting texture was a kind of alchemy one designed not for health, but for performance, shelf life, and profit margins. Once you've looked beneath the surface and seen what's there, you can never fold the diaper back up the same way. It will always feel different in your hand. Lighter, somehow, as though the illusion has drained out of it, but also heavier with the weight of what you now know and the knowledge that so many others do not. And that knowledge is dangerous. Not just for the companies that depend on trust to survive, but for the people who carry it, because once you see the chemicals no one talks about, you can never look at that soft, white surface again without wondering what exactly is pressed against a child's skin. Asterisk. It lingers like a shadow that refuses to move even when the sun shifts. Time has passed, yet it hasn't softened the edges. Instead, the years have made it sharper, harder to ignore, and heavier to carry. The air carries the weight of it, thick and unyielding, as if every breath must push through something unseen. There is no grand monument for it, no plaque, no ceremony. It hides in plain sight, woven into the quiet spaces between conversations, buried under the noise of everyday life. But it is there, like the faint hum of a machine that never switches off. It's not the kind of legacy people carve into stone and brag about. It's the kind that whispers in the dark, reminding those who know that nothing stays buried forever. Some walk with it unknowingly, carrying it in their bodies, in their habits, in the way they flinch at certain thoughts. Others feel it like an ache, a dull throb in the mind that grows sharper when they're alone. It is not celebrated, only endured, as if endurance were the only form of acknowledgement possible. It started with choices made long ago, choices dressed up as progress and necessity, decisions that looked clean on paper but stained everything they touched. At first, no one wanted to admit the stain was real. It was easier to believe it was an illusion, easier to look away and let time smudge the outlines until they blurred. But time didn't erase it, deepened it. It seeped into the cracks, into the foundations, into the very structure of the world built on top of it. And now, it's everywhere, not in a loud, obvious way, but in the quiet persistence of something that refuses to be forgotten. It moves without sound, but its presence is felt in the unease that creeps in when you pause too long to think about how we got here. It waits in the spaces no one likes to explore, in the uncomfortable truths tucked behind locked doors. Some try to speak about it, their words careful, measured, as if naming it out loud might bring consequences they can't control. Others pretend they've never heard of it, that it belongs to another generation, as if the present were somehow immune. But deep down, there's a collective knowing, a recognition that the story didn't end where people like to say it did. It's still unfolding, even if the chapters are written in silence. And silence is the cruelest accomplice. It protects the past from scrutiny, shields the decisions that brought this into existence. It lets the legacy grow, unchallenged, as if it were a natural part of the world. But it isn't natural. It was made deliberately, strategically, and with enough conviction to last decades. If you look closely, you can see its fingerprints in the smallest details. a certain hesitation in the air when old records are mentioned, the way some archives are missing pages that should have been there, the quiet reassignments of people who ask too many questions, each sign small enough to dismiss, but together they form a pattern that can't be ignored, that those who have tried to uncover it know that the trail is uneven, sometimes disappearing entirely, forcing them to feel their way forward in the dark. What they find rarely offers comfort. It's not a neat story, not something that can be wrapped up and put away. It's tangled, messy, and alive, feeding on the reluctance of people to face it head-on. And yet there's something more dangerous than denial. It's acceptance, not the healthy kind that comes from truth, but the resigned kind where people decide it's too late to change anything, where they tell themselves the damage is already done, so why disturb the peace that's left? That's how legacies like this survive. Not through power, not through fear alone, but through the slow, steady erosion of will. There are moments, rare and fleeting, when the truth almost breaks through. A leak, a confession, an overheard fragment that slips past the defenses. In those moments, the air changes sharper, colder as if the past itself is leaning in to see how far the present will go. But just as quickly, the moment passes and the doors close again. Still, the weight remains. It's in the soil, in the water, in the stories half told to the next generation. It shapes the way people live without them realizing it, steering choices in ways too subtle to trace, and perhaps that's the most haunting part, not that the legacy exists, but that it's become so normal we've stopped seeing it at all. But it sees us, always, watching, waiting, reminding us in ways small and sharp that the past doesn't vanish just because we stop speaking its name. It sits at the edges of our lives, patient and persistent, knowing that someday someone will have to face it. The question is, who will have the courage to do it and what will be left standing when they do? If you want, I can also write the section so it builds to an even darker, almost horror-like crescendo in the final paragraphs. So the ending hits with more dread. That would make the suspense sharper. It began with numbers, not the kind you find in an accountant's ledger or a quarterly report, but the kind that crawl their way into official records, complaint after complaint, each one carrying the weight of a child's pain. Thousands of them. They came in by phone, by email, in letters carefully written and attached with photographs no parent ever wants to take. The descriptions were unsettlingly similar. Sudden rashes, blistered skin, inconsolable crying, fevers that rose without warning. The sheer volume made it impossible to ignore. Eventually, the matter moved beyond customer service scripts and marketing departments. It landed on the desk of a government body charged with protecting the public from harm. The decision was made quietly, almost reluctantly, to open an investigation. For a moment, it felt like the turning of a tide. Parents who had been dismissed or told it was just coincidence allowed themselves a flicker of hope. Finally, someone with authority would pull back the layers, look past the smiling packaging, and ask the questions that had been avoided for too long. The air seemed to thrum with anticipation. Maybe, at last, there would be answers. But investigations have a rhythm, and this one moved with the strange, stilted steps of something walking carefully through a minefield. Inspectors requested samples, gathered reports, and examined manufacturing processes. There were meetings behind closed doors, summaries passed between agencies, and technical language that seemed deliberately designed to say a lot without revealing much. When the official testing began, it was narrow in scope, so narrow that it was almost surgical. The focus was on acute hazards, the kind that would cause immediate and obvious harm after a single use. There was little attention given to the possibility of slow, cumulative effects, the kind of harm that might not reveal itself in a single diaper, but in dozens, hundreds, used over months. It was like checking a locked door without asking what was hidden behind it. As weeks passed, something in the tone shifted. Those who had been in regular contact with investigators found their calls returned less often, their questions answered with vague reassurances instead of specifics. The sense of urgency that had been present at the start seemed to drain away, replaced with procedural politeness and delays that stretched into silence. Then, one day, it was over. The announcement was brief, almost clinical. No evidence of a safety hazard had been found. The case was closed. There would be no recall, no warning labels, no admission of fault. It was as if the thousands of complaints had been swallowed whole by the investigation, leaving nothing behind but a few lines in a public statement. To the parents who had been waiting, it felt like a rug pulled from under their feet. How could so many voices, so many identical stories vanish into nothing? The explanation, if you could call it that, lay in the fine print. Testing had only looked for certain toxins, certain immediate reactions, under certain conditions. Anything outside that narrow frame might as well not exist. It was a clever kind of erasure. By defining the terms of the investigation so tightly, the outcome had been decided before it began. And yet, to the outside world, it looked like due diligence had been done. Headlines, where they appeared at all, echoed the official line. No hazard found. But there were things the headlines didn't mention. They didn't mention the parents who had been told off the record that the product probably wasn't the cause. A statement based on the absence of proof rather than proof of absence. They didn't mention the independent scientists who had raised concerns about chronic exposure to certain compounds, concerns that never made it into the final report. They didn't mention the quiet satisfaction of a corporation that could now point to the investigation as a shield against future criticism. In the weeks that followed, the story faded. The forums and social media posts that had once been crowded with warnings began to thin out. Some were deleted, others buried under the relentless tide of new content. Parents who had fought to be heard found themselves speaking into a void. The silence was almost worse than the dismissals. They weren't being argued with anymore. They were simply being ignored. But the memories didn't fade for those who had lived them. The sight of a baby's skin turning red and raw within hours. The sound of a scream that no amount of rocking could soothe. The guilt of wondering whether they had unknowingly caused it by trusting the wrong product. Those things stayed, and beneath the surface, so did the anger. The official file might have been closed, but the questions remained unanswered and unwelcome. Why had the scope been so limited? Why had repeated exposure been ignored? Why had thousands of nearly identical accounts been reduced to a statistical footnote? Perhaps the most chilling question of all was this: if the evidence had pointed in another direction, if the results had been damning, would the outcome have been any different? Or would it have been handled the same way, buried under technicalities, and language designed to calm rather than inform? In the end, the 2010 investigation left behind nothing but a void where the truth might have been. And into that void poured the same smiling images, the same pastel packages, the same promises of safety and care. Shelves stayed stocked. Sales stayed strong. The machine kept moving forward, untouched, but somewhere out there in living rooms and kitchens and quiet nurseries, the people who had seen what could happen kept their stories alive. They may have been small voices in a vast silence, but they knew something most people didn't, that sometimes the most dangerous conclusions are the ones that let everything stay exactly the same.